I'm Mungo Darkmatter, and welcome to Dark Matters. Today on Dark Matters, I'm going to be installing a motherboard into a machine. I'm replacing the motherboard because I believe the motherboard actually went bad. And I actually started to install it today and realized that the heatsink in the fan that was in the computer won't hook up to the new motherboard that I have. This is not a standard connection. The computer is made by HP, and they have a different way to connect the heatsink down onto the motherboard than is standardly used in kind of OEM stuff that's made for just general putting together PCs. Right? In other words, the more generic ones, I guess is what you would say. So I've headed off to the computer store to get a heatsink and fan that will fit on this motherboard. Alright, I'm back from inside the store and I've got my heatsink and fan here. Pretty sure this is gonna work. Alright, here's the old motherboard. And I've taken out the screws right here, and all along the board where they're holding down the board. Alright, these are the memory slots right here. These little levers on the sides. If you click them out, that is how you unlock it so you can pop out the memory chip. Right here is where the CPU was, and there's a little lever right here. You can push that down. It comes up like that, and that's what unlocks it and locks it into place. And I had to remove some screws that was holding down the heatsink and the fan. And so now this board is ready to take out. I put the chip in the CPU chip and the memory chips in the new board before I even started unscrewing this board, just so they would be safe and undamaged. And I put them back in the static-free bag that the motherboard came into. So the next thing will be to take this board out and then put the motherboard in. Alright, the other thing you have to do is there's a back face plate here that you push through to get it out. So there's a square here, and a new plate comes with the new motherboard because it will match its configurations of sockets for the particular motherboard. So if it has extra sockets or less sockets than the other ones, it should match it exactly. So then you put that on the back of the motherboard and it will slide into where this space is. Now the next thing is you have to make sure you connect all of the cables to the correct connectors on the motherboard. So you need to look at the directions on the motherboard. Also make note of what's connected where on the board you're replacing, if you're actually replacing a board. So this here is the system fan, and this says sysfan. And that code there, when I looked it up in the manual, means that this is for the system fan power. So I'm going to plug that right into there. So that's the first thing that needs to be plugged in. And then you just move along and make sure you plug each one in. After we put the fan and heatsink for the CPU on over here, there's a plug right here for the power for that fan as well. Alright, so I've got all of the cords going to the front panel and the front audio panel and such, and the headphone jack connected here. Many of these are keyed plugs, and if it's a keyed plug, you're pretty safe putting it in because it can only go in one way. You've got to be careful with unkeyed plugs, and you may have to look at what the leads are on those and follow them back to figure out which way it goes. Now over here is the power for the main motherboard. I'm going to plug that in before I put the fan on to the CPU and the heatsink onto the CPU. So just plug that in there. And this connector right here is the power for the CPU. So we need to make sure we put that in. But I'm going to wait until I get the fan in. Alright, I put the CPU fan in. There's a clip here and there's a lever here that locks it down. So you've got to clip it onto this side first and then bring it through and clip it onto the other side and push the lever down. I've got the power in here for the fan, which is very important. And now I'm going to put the last plug in. I'm going to put the last plug in, which is the plug for the CPU. Okay, I've got the CPU plug in. It's important to make sure none of the wires get in the way of the fan or other things, so you may want to push them into place and even tie them down if necessary to keep them into place so they don't get in the way of things that might cause trouble, particularly fans. Alright, so we've got everything installed and the motherboard installed and the connectors correct, and we started it up. Alright, I've got the hard drive back in there, and I've got the DVD connected and the hard drive connected. You got to make sure you've got all the connectors in and everything connected back up. I'm going to turn it on one more time. And I hear the drive cranking up and everything, so looks like it's good. It's best to test it a couple of times as you're finishing putting it up together to make sure things are working correctly, so you don't have to take the whole thing apart. You don't want to assemble everything and just put the case back together and then find out it doesn't start, so you need to test it. Boot the machine up and it says CPU or memory changed, please enter setup to configure your system. F1 to run setup, F2 to load default values. When you first build a computer or change a motherboard or any major part, you're going to get this. So hit F1 and we'll go into setup, and we're going to go to, so I'm going to go to settings. So I just hit enter to go into settings. You should be able to go into BIOS and then just go save it and exit, and it should automatically detect everything. It seems to have. It says there's an AMD A8 56K APU, which is correct, and it looks like it found the correct amount of RAM and everything, so that all looks correct. So I hit enter and save, and save and reboot. Yes. Now let's see what happens. Looks like it's a little bit happier now. And at the bottom it says how you can run the BIOS setup again if you need to. It's figuring something out here. I think it is booting up now. The other problem we may have is with Windows itself booting, or there might be bad drivers in Windows, or the drivers might need to be adjusted. The drivers actually will have to be updated. The motherboard comes with a disc with drivers on it, or you can go to the manufacturer's website and find the drivers and make sure you have the latest drivers for the motherboard when you've changed it or if you've installed a new one. Alright, now I come up with this screen. This actually means I have to go back into settings and make a few changes. I have to change the settings to legacy settings because my older system used BIOS and the newer system's using a system called Unify that replaces BIOS. So let's go into the settings and fix those few things and see what happens next. Okay, we're back into the setup screen. Now this may vary depending on what motherboard you had in previously and what your new motherboard is and what the setup is like. But we're going to go under boot in this case, and we're going to change a couple of things. One is right here where it says boot mode select. It has UEFI, which is pronounced Unify. We're going to hit enter and go into there, and we're going to select Legacy plus Unify. Hit enter. Now on this particular setup, it's a little bit tricky. We have to scroll all the way down to the bottom. There's actually a scroll bar on the side here, and there's a couple of hidden extra settings down here, and one of them is called Unify Hard Disk Drive BBS Priorities. We're going to go into there, and where it says boot option 1, we're going to hit enter, and we're going to, right now it has Unify OS, but we're going to select Windows Boot Manager and hit enter, and hit escape out of here, and we're going to save and exit, and save changes and reboot, and then yes to save the changes. Okay, now it boots into Windows. Now the other problem you may have here is it may complain that this is no longer the same computer. Since the motherboard is a major component of the computer, Windows on your old hard disk will think it's on a different computer, and it will complain about that. And I will have a link in the video below on where to go for instructions on how to manually activate Windows when you've changed the motherboard. Here are some caveats to be aware of when you replace a motherboard. When you're speccing out a new motherboard, if you want to use your old CPU chip or your old RAM chips, make sure that the new motherboard will support the particular type of RAM chips or CPU chips you have. Also, if you may want to update the CPU chip in the future, make sure the new motherboard will support better chips or upgraded chips. So that's something to look at. Also, you want to make sure the motherboard has enough slots to expand the memory beyond what you have in case you want to upgrade that as well. The other thing to check is the form factor of the motherboard to make sure that it will fit in the case that you have. Unify versus BIOS. If you go from a motherboard that's using BIOS to one that's using Unify, you'll have to set some legacy settings to get your old hard drive to boot back up. So that's something to be aware of. Install disks will not recognize new motherboard unless they are a generic OEM version of Windows. Dell and HP have their own OEM version of Windows that look to see if the PC's been manufactured by them. If the PC hasn't been manufactured by them, the install disks will not work. When you install a third-party motherboard, the identification that identifies it as Dell or HP or whatever the PC originally was will be gone, and so your OEM disks probably won't work if you're using a set of disks from a major manufacturer. So that's something to be aware of. Also, at the time when you buy a motherboard or a hard drive, you can usually get a copy of the generic OEM version of Windows. And so that's something to be aware of. You may want to purchase it when you purchase your motherboard if you think that will be an issue for you. You should still be able to start up the hard drive once you get the motherboard installed. But you probably have to manually activate Windows again. So that's something to be aware of. You'll be able to, in other words, use the old hard drive and get it to work as it has before, but if you need to reinstall the operating system for whatever reason, you'll need to buy a new set of disks. You probably have to manually activate Windows when you replace your motherboard because the motherboard is a major component, and Windows looks for major component changes and will ask for reactivation if something major has changed in your computer, and a motherboard is really the computer itself, basically. Here's the knowledge base article link on Microsoft that tells you how to go through manual activation if you change your motherboard. And I will also put a link to the knowledge base article in the description of this video below. I'm Mungo Darkmatter, and this has been Dark Matters, and whatever you do, enjoy technology. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.